I was 78 years old when I spent Christmas alone for the first time in my life. It wasn't because I didn't have a family. I did. Children, grandchildren, even a great-grandchild who was still crawling. But that night, while the table was set for 12 people, only I was there. The chairs were empty, the dishes untouched. The turkey was getting cold in the center of the table, as if waiting for someone who would never come. En de première que nuit. I knew they weren't coming. Before we begin, if you feel touched by these issues and want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new journey of transformation and self-discovery is shared here. Don't miss the chance to hear more stories from people who are discovering the strength within themselves. For years, my house was the center of everything. Birthdays, Sunday lunches, holidays. I was always the hostess, the one who prepared everything, who opened the doors, who smiled when someone arrived late or brought extra people unannounced. I liked it. Or at least I thought I liked it. My husband died almost 20 years ago. And when he passed away, I felt like a part of me went with him. But I still had my children. I had my grandchildren. I had a big house full of memories and a bank account that my husband left well organized. He was always careful with money. He always told me to save, not to depend on anyone. En de première que pitaille was elle. But, over time, I realized that the visits began to change. At first, they were spontaneous. My children would show up for no reason, just to have coffee and chat. But, gradually, the visits began to follow a pattern. They always came when they needed something. My oldest daughter, Beatrice, would show up when her husband was unemployed. She never asked directly. She would just casually mention that things were difficult, that the rent was overdue, that the children needed school supplies, and I would help. Of course I would help. She was my daughter. My son, Ricardo, would come whenever there was a business opportunity. He always had ideas. He always believed he was one step away from getting rich, and I believed in him. Or maybe I just wanted to believe, so I would help again, because that's what mothers do. Right, mothers believe, mothers support. And my youngest daughter, Juliana, she was different. She didn't ask for money as often, but when she did, it was always for something big. A home renovation, a trip she deserved, a new car because the old one was having problems. And I gave it to her because I had it, and because, deep down, I thought giving was a way of being loved. Years passed, and the visits continued, but I started to notice something. They only showed up when they needed something. When première calède, when I suggested lunch, they always had another commitment. But when they needed something, then they always had time. I pretended not to notice. I pretended to believe the excuses. I pretended not to feel the emptiness growing inside me each time they left without truly looking me in the eyes. Until one day, about 6 months ago, something changed. I was at the bank, sorting out some retirement matters, and the manager, a nice young woman who always helped me, called me aside for a chat. She said that my account balance was much lower than it used to be. That, at the rate I was spending, in a few years I wouldn't have anything left. I left there with a heavy heart, because, for the first time, I understood what was happening. I was being consumed, not by love, but by convenience. And there, sitting on the bus seat, on my way home, I made a decision. I wasn't going to give them money anymore. Not because I had stopped loving my children, but because I needed to know if they still loved me. So I started saying no. When Beatrice called asking for help with the rent, I told her I was strapped for cash, that my pension wasn't enough to cover everything. She was silent for a few seconds, then mumbled, "Okay, Mom, we'll talk later," and hung up. She didn't call again. When Ricardo came up with yet another brilliant idea, I told him I couldn't help this time. Ego en gris. He said I didn't believe him, that I never had, and he stormed out, slamming the door. He didn't come back. And Juliana, when she found out I wasn't going to pay for the renovations to her house, simply stopped answering my calls. At first, I thought it was just a phase, that they would understand, that they would come back, but they didn't. Weeks turned into months, and the silence grew heavier and heavier. I called, and no one answered. I sent messages and received short, cold replies. "I'm busy, Mom. We'll talk later. I don't have time right now." And I realized that, for them, I only had value as long as I had something to offer. Then December arrived, and with it, the anticipation of Christmas. I've always been the hostess. I've always prepared everything. But that year, I waited. I waited for someone to call, for someone to ask how I was, for someone to say, "Mom, let's spend Christmas at your house," like always. Nobody cared. 2 weeks before Christmas, I personally called each of my children. I invited them all. I said I was going to prepare everything, as always. That I wanted to have the family together. Beatrice said she would think about it. Ricardo said he might be able to stop by. Juliana said she had other plans, but that she would see. None of them confirmed it. Deep dawn as they prepared about the food. I tied the table 12 plus. Salué. On Christmas Eve, I called again, just to confirm. Beatrice said she wouldn't be able to do it. That the children were sick. Ricardo didn't even answer. And Juliana sent a message. "Mom, this year I'm going to spend Christmas with my husband's family. Have a good holiday." And so, on the 25th of December, I found myself alone, looking at that set table, at the empty plates, at the chairs that no one would occupy. I sat at the head of the table, where I always sat, and for the first time in a long time, I let the tears fall without trying to hide them. But while I was crying, something inside me began to change. Because I realized that, for all those years, I had believed that my worth lay in what I could give, that I was only loved because I had something to offer. And when I stopped giving, they stopped coming. And that showed me who they really were. But it also showed me who I had allowed myself to become. I sat at that table for hours. The silence in the house was so profound that I could hear the clock on the wall, each second marking the time I had been there, alone, on a day that should have been one of togetherness. I looked at the turkey, at the stuffing I had made the way my children liked it, at the dessert I had prepared thinking of my grandchildren, and I realized how much effort I had put into it for people who didn't even have the consideration to call and say they weren't coming. But you know what was worse? It wasn't the loneliness. It wasn't the ruined Christmas. It was realizing that, deep down, I already knew they weren't coming. And even so, I prepared everything, as if preparing the food, tidying the house, setting the table was a way of denying the truth I didn't want to face. The truth is that I had raised children who only sought me out when they needed something. And the truth is that I had allowed it. I got up from the table and went to the window. The street was empty. The houses around me had lights on, sounds of laughter, of music, families gathered. And there I was, behind my window, watching life unfold outside while mine seemed to have stopped. I went to my room. I lay down on the bed. And, for the first time in a long time, instead of trying to find excuses for their behavior, I allowed myself to feel the full pain of what was happening. I felt used, discarded, as if I had been just a resource that, when it dried up, ceased to be useful, and I cried. I cried like I hadn't cried since my husband died. I cried for all the years I pretended not to notice. I cried for all the times I gave money, knowing that, deep down, I was buying attention. I cried because I felt like an idiot, because I felt weak, because, at 78, I saw myself as a woman who didn't know how to be a mother in a way that truly mattered. I slept badly that night. I woke up several times with a tightness in my chest, with the feeling that something was wrong. And it was. Everything was wrong. The next day, December 26th, I woke up to find the house still tidy for the party that never happened. And I had to put everything away. The food that nobody ate. The dishes that nobody used. And while I was putting it away, I felt a mixture of sadness and anger. Anger towards them, but mostly towards myself, because I had allowed it. I had taught them wiederverbals, alweergiving, and they learned. They learned that they didn't need to give me anything in return. Not attentions, no true love I state. It wasn't depression, it was something different. It was as if I were observing my own life from the outside, trying to understand how I got there. And gradually, I began to notice things that I had previously pretended not to see. I realized that, in recent years, whenever my children came to visit me, they never stayed very long. They would arrive, take care of what they needed to take care of, and leave. They never asked how I really was. They were never interested in my life, my days, my pain. I realized I knew everything about their lives. I knew about their problems at work, their marital arguments, their difficulties with their children. But they knew nothing about me. They didn't know I was afraid of growing old alone. They didn't know that sometimes I would go days without speaking to anyone. They didn't know I felt invisible. Because I never told them. Because, for me, being a mother meant not being a burden. It meant solving their problems, not creating new ones by talking about my own. And that's when something inside me started to reorganize itself. Because I understood that the problem wasn't just theirs. It was mine too. I had spent entire years putting myself in a role. The role of the mother who gives, the mother who helps, the mother who always has the door open and a helping hand. And in that role, I forgot to be a person. I forgot to have boundaries. I forgot to demand reciprocity. And they got used to it. They got used to a mother who never said no, who never demanded anything, who never asked for anything in return. So when I changed, when I started saying no, they didn't know how to handle it. Because I was breaking the silent agreement we had built over the years. And instead of trying to understand, instead of asking what was happening to me, they simply walked away. It was at that moment that I realized something important, something that changed everything. I realized that, during all those years, I had been living in a state of constant need, a need to be loved, a need to be important, a need to feel that I had value. And to satisfy that need, I gave. I gave money, I gave time, I gave attention, I gave everything that was asked of me. And the more I gave, the more I expected to receive something in return. Not money, but love, presence, recognition. But that didn't work, because the more I gave, in order to receive, the less I received. And the less I received, the more I gave, trying to compensate, trying to make them see me, value me, love me. It was a cycle that consumed me, that left me increasingly empty, increasingly needy, increasingly dependent on their attention, and they sensed it. Even without consciously realizing it, they felt that I was giving out of necessity, not out of true love. And this created a strange dynamic where I became more and more of an obligation, not a presence they desired. I understood this one afternoon in January while sitting on the porch looking at the garden I tended myself. It was soot, the kind of heavy heat that seems to cling to the skin. And suddenly a memory came to me, a memory from when my children were little. Ricardo, around 6 years old, coming home from school and hugging me just because. Beatrice, as a teenager, inviting me to watch a movie together. Juliana, asking me to comb her hair, even though she was already long enough to do it herself. They sought for no reason, with anything, just because they wanted to be with me. And I wondered, what has changed? The response came quickly, and it hurt. I changed. I started giving things instead of giving my presence. I started compensating for my insecurity with money. I started believing that if I didn't have something to offer, they wouldn't have a reason to seek me out. And they learned that. They learned that coming to me was synonymous with receiving something. And over time, the relationship became conditioned by that. But now, sitting on that balcony on a warm and quiet January day, I've made a different decision. I wasn't going to try to force anything anymore. I wasn't going to call insistently anymore. I wasn't going to throw parties hoping they would come anymore. I wasn't going to live waiting for crumbs of attention anymore. I was going to change, not for them, for myself. I was going to start living for myself, to value myself, to understand that my worth didn't depend on what I could give, that I was important simply for existing, simply for being who I was. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something different. It wasn't happiness. Not yet. But it was something akin to dignity. As if, finally, I was rising from a place where I had been kneeling for too long. The first few days after that decision was strange, because it was like I was learning to live again, but in a different way, without waiting, without planning around them, without constantly hoping someone think thing. I'd wake up and, instead of cleaning the whole house thinking about when someone would come to visit, I'd just do what was necessary. I'd have my coffee calmly. I'd sit on the porch and just stay there, watching the day begin. It sounds silly, but for me it was revolutionary, because for the first time I wasn't doing anything for someone else. I was just being. Juste existing. And that, somehow, gave me a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I also started going out more. Nothing to elaborate. I'd go to the square near my house. I'd sit on a bench and watch people go by. Children playing, couples walking, elderly people playing dominoes. And I felt like I belonged there. No longer isolated inside my house, waiting for someone to include me in their lives. It was on one of those afternoons in the square that I met Donna Mercedes. She was about 82 years old, with completely white hair, tied in a low bun, and a smile that lit up her whole face. She sat on the bench next to mine, and we started talking. At first, it was just small-town talk. About the weather, about the children running around, about how the park had changed over the years. But, little by little, The conversation deepened. She told me she had been a widow for 15 years, that she had 3 children, all married, all with their own lives, and that, about 5 years ago, she had made a decision similar to mine. She had decided to stop living for her children and start living for herself. I asked how it had gone, if the children had understood, if she regretted it. She smiled, a sad smile, but one full of wisdom. It was difficult at first, she said, because we get used to believing that being a mother means giving up everything. That it means always being available, always ready, always giving. And when we stop doing that, it feels like we're being selfish. You know, I knew exactly what she was talking about. But then I realized something. She continued. I realized that when I was constantly waiting for their attention, I was always frustrated, always hurt, always feeling like I wasn't enough. And that made me bitter. Première demande dite, even without felt it. They felt that being with me was a burden. She paused, looking at the children playing in the playground. When I started living for myself, when I stopped expecting them to fill the void inside me, something changed. I became lighter, more whole. And, curiously, they started to get closer again, not because I was giving something, but because I was different. Because being with me was no longer an obligation burdened with unspoken expectations. Those words stayed with me. They kept echoing in my head for days. Could that be it? Could my neediness, my yearning to be loved, be precisely what was pushing people away? Could things change by changing my inner state, by ceasing to live in lack and beginning to live in fulfillment? I didn't know, but I started paying attention. I began to notice that in moments when I was at peace with myself, occupied with something that made me feel alive, things around me seemed to flow better. Small things. A neighbor passing by and stopping to chat. A connection with an old friend I hadn't seen in years. An invitation to afternoon tea at the neighborhood community center. And in those moments when I reverted to my old self, when I found myself staring at my phone, waiting for someone to call, feeling sorry for myself, the words "Nobody kalednang" happened. I felt even more alone. It was as if life responded to my inner state. When I was lacking, needy, life gave me more lack, more loneliness, more rejection. But when I was whole, when I felt sufficient, when I valued myself, life began to bring me good things, people, opportunities, moments of joy. This didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like I was learning a new language. The language of respecting myself, of valuing myself, of understanding that I didn't need to beg for love, that I was worthy of love simply for existing. February arrived, and with it, Ricardo's birthday. He would be turning 43. In previous years, I always threw a party for him. Or, välist, specialangenland, byttatjö, or any of that. Not because I was angry, but because I was respecting the space he had chosen to have. On his birthday, I just sent a message, short, simple, happy birthday, my son. I love you. I hope your day is wonderful. He didn't answer, and surprisingly, I didn't feel destroyed by it. I felt a pang, yes, but it wasn't that devastating pain from before. It was just a mild sadness that came and went, because I was learning that true love doesn't demand a response. It doesn't require immediate reciprocity. It's not an investment expecting a return. It's simply an expression, a truth that I felt and that I could express, regardless of the other person's response. And that freed me in a way I didn't expect. In March, I decided to do something I'd always wanted to do but never had. I decided to enroll in a course, a watercolor painting course at the city's cultural center. I've always enjoyed painting. When I was young, before I got married, I painted a lot. Nothing professional, just for pleasure. But after I got married, after the children were born, after life started happening, I stopped. I always felt I didn't have time, that I had more important things to do. But now I had time, and I had the freedom to choose how to use it. Classes were twice a week, in the afternoon. And from the very first class, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. There was something magical about dipping the brush in the paint, watching the colors blend on the paper, creating something with my own hands. And I met people, interesting people, people who were also there looking for something to fill their lives. They weren't close friends, not at first, but they were company. They were conversations. They were laughs. And I realized I was building a life that didn't depend on my children, a life that was mine. That didn't mean I didn't think about them. I did, every day. I missed them. I missed my grandchildren. But it was different now. It wasn't that desperate longing, that consuming pain. It was a gentle nostalgia that coexists with life, but doesn't paralyze it. Probra, on the team prepare anything. I didn't call to invite anyone. I didn't set the table expecting someone to show up. I bought a small chocolate egg for myself. I made a simple lunch. And I spent the day painting. And it was one of the most peaceful days I've had in a long time. It was also in April that something unexpected happened. I was returning from the market, carrying two bags that weren't very heavy, but which, for me, at 78 years old, were already requiring some effort. And as I turned the corner near my house, I bumped into someone. It was Beatrice, my daughter. We stood there, looking at each other for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. She looked different, thinner, with dark circles under her eyes. And in her eyes, I saw something that broke my heart. I saw weariness. I saw pain. "Mom," she said softly. "Hi, my daughter," I replied. She looked at the bags I was carrying. "Let me help you." We walked home together, in silence. A heavy silence, full of unspoken things. When we arrived, she put the bags in the kitchen and stood there, unsure what to do. She didn't know whether to leave or stay. I offered her a coffee. She accepted. We sat at the table, the same table that, months ago, was set for a family that didn't come, and she began to speak. She said things were difficult, that her husband was still unemployed, that she had taken to jobs to try and pay the bills, but even that wasn't enough, that the children were suffering because of the situation, that she was exhausted. And while she was talking, I just listened. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't offer money. I just listened. When she finished, she kept looking at me, as expectfait papi, but I didn't offer. Instead, I asked, "And how are you, Beatrice? How are you really?" She blinked, surprised by the question, as if no one had asked her that in a long time, and then it all collapsed. Je criais. She cried like a child, and I got up, went to her, and hugged her. I didn't say I was going to solve the problems. I didn't say I was going to give money. I just held my daughter while she cried, and I realized that's what she needed, not money, but affection, presence, to be seen as a person, not as a list of problems to be solved. When she calmed down, she looked at me with red eyes and said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for everything." I didn't ask why she was apologizing. Première que nous. And she knew that I knew. Everything's fine, I said. And it was true. Everything was fine. She stayed a little longer. We talked about simple things, about the children, about the routine, about life. And when she left, she hugged me in a way she hadn't hugged me in years. And for the first time since Christmas, I felt that maybe, just maybe, something was changing. Not because I had started giving again, but because I had changed. And that change, in some way, was creating space for something new to happen. After that meeting with Beatrice, something inside me reorganized itself in an even deeper way. Because I realized that the change I had made wasn't just about stopping giving money. It was about changing who I was in the relationship. It was about stopping being the mother who solved everything and starting to be the mother who was present, but who also had limits, who also had her own life. And the most interesting, I was realizing that from my children. I was, in fact, creating the possibility of a more genuine relationship. A relationship where they could see me as a person, not as a resource, and where I could see them as people too, with their own journeys, their own challenges, their own responsibilities. In the following weeks, Beatrice came back a few times, not to ask for anything, just to talk, to have coffee, to show me pictures of the children. And, little by little, we rebuilt something. It wasn't like before. It was different, but it was more honest, more real. She told me that after that day she cried in my kitchen, she had talked to her husband, that they had made some difficult decisions, that they were selling the car, moving to a smaller apartment, cutting expenses, that it was painful, but that somehow it was bringing them closer as a couple. And she thanked me. She said that if I had solved their problems one more time, they would never have learned to solve them on their own. They would never have matured. That touched me deeply, because I realized that by respecting myself, by setting boundaries, I wasn't being selfish. I was, in fact, allowing them to grow, to become real adults. In May, something happened that surprised me even more. I was at home, painting. I had just finished a watercolor of a sunset, something I had seen in the square a few days before, and I was there, admiring my work, when the phone rang. It was Ricardo. My heart raced, because it had been months since I'd spoken to him. Since that day, he stormed out, slamming the door, angry because I hadn't given him money for yet another of his projects. I answered with my heart in my throat. "Mom," his voice sounded hesitant. "Hi, my son." There was a silence, long, uncomfortable. I wanted to speak with you. I waited. I didn't say anything. I just gave him space to continue. "Mom, I behaved very badly. I know that, and I'm so sorry." His voice was choked with emotion, and I felt my eyes welling up with tears. "I've spent these past months thinking about how I always treated you like you were a bank, like you only had value for what you could give me. And that's awful, Mom, that's awful, and I can't believe I did that." I couldn't speak. The emotion was too strong. "I know I don't have the right to apologize," he continued, "but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change. I'm working. It's nothing grand. It's not one of my big projects. It's just a normal office job. But it's honest, and I'm learning to live with what I earn. To not always wait for something magical to happen and solve my life." He paused. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "And I wanted to know if you would agree to see me. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to see you. To talk, if you want, of course. I wiped the tears from my face and, with a trembling voice, replied, Of course I want to, my son. Of course I want to. We made plans for the following weekend. And when I hung up the phone, I sat there trying to process what had just happened. Because I realized something. Something that, until that moment, I hadn't fully understood. When I was in a state of neediness, desperate for attention and love, my children responded by distancing themselves. Because that state created a heavy energy, a suffocating expectation, a silent demand that they felt even if I didn't say anything. But when I changed my state, when I started to value myself, to respect myself, to live for myself, when I stopped needing them to feel complete, something changed in the energy around me, and they started to respond differently. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a real change within me that was reflected on the outside. It was as if, by becoming whole, I had given them permission to approach me in a genuine way, without that invisible pressure of having to fill my void. Meeting Ricardo was emotional. He arrived with flowers. Simple flowers from the market. But to me they meant more than any expensive He sat on the porch on Douet Alked. We really talked. For the first time in years, she felt like we were truly seeing each other. Not as a mother who gives and a son who receives, but as to people. To people with stories, with pain, with lessons learned. He told me about how he had hit rock bottom, how he had lost everything in yet another failed project. How he was left without money, without prospects, without knowing what to do. And how, in that moment of despair, he had realized that he had always had a safety net, me. And that this safety net, while protecting him, also prevented him from maturing. When you said no, Mom, he said, looking at his hands, I was so angry. I thought you didn't care about me, but now I understand. I understand that you were actually respecting me enough to let me face my own consequences. And then he looked me in the eyes, and I wanted to say thank you. Because if it weren't for that, I would never have learned. I would never have grown. At that moment, I felt that everything had been worth it. All the suffering, all the loneliness, all the pain. Because I had helped my son become a real man. Not by giving him what he wanted, but by giving him the space to discover who he was capable of being. The following months were a time of rebuilding. Beatrice would visit me regularly. Ricardo too. And, little by little, even Juliana began to show signs of returning. She didn't come in person at first, but she started replying to my messages. Short, but respectful, and in June, she called me. She said she wanted to talk, that she had thought a lot about everything, and that she would like to see me. When she showed up at my house one Saturday afternoon, I noticed she was different too, more mature, less arrogant. We in the same room we were, month before I had spent Christmas alone, with tears in her eyes, apologized to me. He said that she had behaved horribly, that she had treated me, her mother, as if I were just an obligation, someone who was there to serve her, but who didn't deserve respect or consideration. And he said something that deeply affected me. Mom, I realized that I learned from you not to value myself because you never valued yourself. You always put yourself last. You always prioritized everyone else but yourself. And I grew up thinking that's how a woman should be. Alloué Jiving, always negating herself. And I realized that I was doing that in my marriage. I was negating myself. I was putting myself last. And I was unhappy. She wiped away her tears. But when you started yourself each welcomer yourself, it made me see that I also needed to change, that I also needed to respect myself. And I'm trying. Mom, I'm trying to learn to self, just like you are learning. I hugged my daughter, and I felt that, somehow, by changing myself, I had given her a gift, the gift of an example. The example that it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to value yourself. July has arrived, and with it, my birthday, 79 years old. I wasn't expecting anything. I didn't make any plans. Premier jour occupe, like about my life. But, in the middle of the morning, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, I got a fright. They were all there. Beatriz, Ricardo, Juliana, and 8 children, and even the great-grandson, already walking, holding his mother's hand. Beatrice was holding a cake. Ricardo had a bag with things for lunch, and Juliana had a bouquet of flowers. Happy birthday, Mom, they said, almost in unison. I couldn't hold back the tears. We all went inside, and for the first time in months, my house came back to life, but it was different now. It wasn't that heavy life full of unspoken expectations. It was a light life, a real life. We prepared lunch together. We talked, we laughed, the children played in the yard, and I, sitting at the head of the table, looked around and felt a profound gratitude. Because I realized that by changing my inner state, by ceasing to live in lack and beginning to live in fullness, I had changed everything around me, not magically, but in a real way. Consistent, true, and this wasn't a one-off coincidence. It was a pattern that repeated itself several times. When in his whole ting floe, whenever I returned to my old state of neediness, things stalled, and I understood. I understood that life responds to who we are, not to who we pretend to be. It responds to our inner state, to our emotional frequency, to the way we see and value ourselves. But there was something my children didn't know, something I had kept to myself, something they would soon discover. And this discovery would change everything again. The months following my birthday were the lightest I'd experienced in years. My house started receiving visitors again, but now they were different. They weren't visits burdened with silent requests or heavy expectations. They were genuine encounters. My chimtalk, to bawit mit shinaway ever experienced beefy. Beatrice would take me out to lunch sometimes. Something simple, a buffet restaurant near the center. But to me, it meant the world, because she chose to be with me. Not because I needed her, but because she wanted to. Ricardo would call me during the week just to see how I was doing. He'd tell me about his work, about the small challenges of everyday life. And he'd ask for advice, not about money, but about life, about how to deal with frustrations, about how to be patient, about how even slowly. And Juliana, who had always been the most distant, started to include me in parts of her life. She invited me to her house a few times. She introduced me to her friends. She treated me with a respect I hadn't felt in a long time. I continued with my painting classes. I continued cultivating my own life. And I realized that the more fulfilled I became, the more the people around me naturally approached me. Not because I was asking for it, but because I was radiating something different. Something that attracted instead of repelling. It was as if, for all those years, I had lived with an invisible sign saying, I need you to feel complete. And people unconsciously ran away from that burden. But now the sign had changed. Now it said, I am complete, and you are welcome to share this fullness with me. And that made all the difference. August arrived, And with it, a date I knew was coming, but that I hadn't mentioned to anyone. An important date. A date that would change everything. On August 15th, I received a call from my lawyer, Dr. Mendez, a gentleman in his 60s who had been handling my legal affairs for decades. "Mrs. Helena," he said, in that formal tone he always used, "we need to schedule a meeting. It's about that matter we discussed last year." I knew what he was talking about, and my heart tightened. "Could it be next week?" I asked. "Yes, you can." "But, Monsieur, Helena, are you sure you want to do this? It's a very important decision." "I'm sure, Dr. Mendez, absolutely sure." I hung up the phone and sat there in the living room armchair, thinking about everything that had happened in the last year, thinking about how I had changed, how my children had changed, how life had shown me, clearly and repeatedly, that inner state determines outer reality, and I thought about the secret I had kept, the secret they didn't know yet. Because, you see, when I spent that Christmas alone, when I realized that my children only approached me out of self-interest, I not only decided to change my behavior, I made another decision as well, a more radical decision. A few days after that lonely Christmas, I went to the registry office, and there, with the help of Dr. Mendez, I did something that would change everything. I had donated all my assets, not for my children, but for charities, for orphanages, nursing homes, social projects. Everything I had saved over the years, everything my husband had left me, everything I had saved, I had decided to donate. But with one condition. The donation would only be finalized and made public after my death. While I was alive, I would continue to have access to the money, to live with dignity and comfort. But when I was gone, there would be nothing left to inherit. Why did I do that? Because I needed to know. I needed to be absolutely certain that, if my children returned, it would be for me, not for what I had, not for the inheritance they imagined receiving one day, but for me, for the person I was, and more than that, I wanted to give them one last lesson. The lesson that a person's true worth is not in what they possess, but in who they are, and that true love is not measured in money, but in presence, in respect, in dignity. But now, almost 8 months later, I was having doubts, because they had come back. They had grown closer. They had changed, and I saw sincerity in that change. I saw that it wasn't just about money. It was about realizing what really mattered. So, should I stick to my decision, or should I change my mind? I spent days thinking about it, days in which I watched my children with heightened attention, trying to understand if the change was real and profound, or if it was superficial and temporary. And what I saw gave me the answer. I saw Ricardo working every day, arriving tired, but with dignity in his eyes. I saw him visit me, even when he was exhausted, because he wanted to be with me, not because he needed something. I saw Beatrice struggling with her financial difficulties, but without asking me for help. I watched her grow, mature, and become a strong and independent woman. I watched Juliana learn to value herself, to set boundaries, to be a more genuine person and less superficial. And I realized that the change was real, that they had learned their lesson, that they had grown. But I also realized something else. I realized that if I reversed my decision now, if I undid the donation and went back to having a significant estate to leave as an inheritance, I would, in a way, be undoing the entire transformation process we had experienced, because the possibility of inheritance, even if unspoken, would always cast a shadow. There would always be the doubt. Are they here for me or for what I will leave behind? And I didn't want that. Not for myself, not for them. So, at the meeting with Dr. Mendez, I confirmed my decision. The donation would go ahead. And, more than that, I decided it was time to tell my children the truth. Not immediately, but soon, because they deserve to know. They deserve to understand that the transformation we experienced hadn't been in vain. That the love we were rebuilding was real, because there was nothing material at stake. September was drawing to a close when I arranged a lunch at my house. I invited all three of them. I said I needed to talk to them about something important. When they arrived, I noticed the worry in their eyes. They thought I was sick, that I had some serious health problem. I prepared a simple lunch, food they liked, and after we ate, when we were all sitting in the living room having coffee, I started to speak. My children, I began, feeling my heart race. I need to tell you something. Something I decided a few months ago that you need to know. They remained silent, attentive. I took a deep breath. At the beginning of this year, right after that Christmas I spent alone, I made a decision. I went to the notary's office and donated all my assets to charities. I saw the shock on their faces. Beatrice's eyes widened. Ricardo turned pale. Juliana opened her mouth, but said nothing. Everything I had, I continued, my voice firm. Everything your father left, everything I saved throughout my life, was donated. When I die, there will be nothing left to inherit. The silence that followed was deafening. Juliana was the first to speak. Mom, why? Why did you do that? I looked at her, at the three of them, and I spoke from the heart. Because I needed to know. I needed to be sure that if you came back, it would be for me, not for what I had. Not for the inheritance you hoped to receive someday, but for me, for the person I am. Tears began to stream down my face, and you came back. You changed. You truly grew closer. And that, to me, is worth more than any amount of money. It's worth more than anything. Ricardo stood up. He came over to me. He knelt in front of me and held my hands. Mom, he said, his voice breaking, I'm not here for the money. I wasn't even thinking about that. I'm here because I love you, because I realized how stupid I was, how much time I wasted treating you like you weren't important. Beatrice also came closer. She sat on the arm of the armchair and hugged me. You did the right thing, Mom. You gave us the chance to be better people, to learn what really matters. And Juliana, who has always been the proudest, the most difficult to open up to, came to me with tears streaming down her face. I don't want your money, Mom. I never really did. I just wanted you to see me. I wanted to be important to you, and I went looking for that in the wrong way, in a selfish way. But now I understand. I understand what you tried to teach us. We stayed there, embracing, crying together, and I felt that this was the truest moment we had shared in decades, because there was nothing left between us besides what truly mattered: love, respect, presence. In the days that followed, I realized that the revelation had created something even stronger between us. It was as if a final barrier had fallen, as if now everything was completely transparent. And they kept coming. They kept visiting me. They kept including me in their lives. Because now they knew there was no material interest involved. That the only thing that motivated them was true love. And I realized even more clearly how everything had connected. When I was in a state of need, of want, of lack, my children would distance themselves. Life gave me more loneliness, more rejection, more emptiness. But when I changed my state of mind, when I started to value myself, to respect myself, to live fully and completely, when I stopped needing them to favor change to come back, not because I manipulated them, not because I did anything to force them, but because the energy around me changed, because I became an attractive presence instead of a suffocating need. And this was repeated several times, in different ways, in different situations. When I was counting fluid, when I reverted to my old patterns, everything stalled. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern of cause and effect, where the internal state determined the external response. I didn't need to call it by any specific name. I didn't need to say it was law of attraction or spirituality or any other term. It was simply life working. It was reality responding to who I was, not to who I pretended to be. And the money, which for so long had been the center of everything, which had been the reason for the estrangement, which had been the tool they used to measure my worth, no longer existed. And it was precisely because it no longer existed that we were finally able to truly meet. October arrived, and with it, the preparation for the end of the year. But now it was different. Now I wasn't alone. Now I knew that when Christmas came, my table wouldn't be empty. But more than that, I knew that no matter who was there or not, I would be okay. Because I had learned to be self-sufficient, to value myself, to be complete on my own. And this completeness, ironically, was what had allowed people to come closer. A few weeks later, I was in the square, on the bench where I always sat, when Donna Mercedes appeared. She sat down beside me, as she did from time to time, and we stayed there in a comfortable silence, watching the children play. Your children came back, didn't they? She asked suddenly. I looked at her, surprised. They're back. How do you know? She smiled. Because you're different. You're lighter. Moral. And that changes everything, doesn't it? Change, I replied. Change everything. And they don't know yet, do they? She continued. About the money. I had told her a few months earlier about my decision to donate everything. She was the only person besides Dr. Mendez who knew. Now they know, I said. I told them a few weeks ago, and how was it? It was liberating, for me and for them. She nodded as if she already knew it would be like this. You know, Helena, she said, gazing at the horizon. People spend their whole life in what tether and what they can give. But true value lies in who they are. And when we learn that, when we truly understand that deep in our souls, everything changes. That's true. I agreed. Everything changes. We stayed there for a while longer, in silence, until she got up to leave. Happy for you, Helena, she said, before leaving. Happy that you found your way. And I sat there on that bench, feeling the warm October sun on my face, and realized she was right. I had found the way, not an external path made of achievements or possessions, but an internal path, a path back to myself, and that path had transformed everything. December arrived again, and with it, the anticipation of Christmas. But now it was a different kind of anticipation. It wasn't that painful anxiety of wanting people to come. It was just a quiet joy of knowing that probably they would come. And if they didn't, I would be okay too. 2 weeks before Christmas, Beatrice called me. Mom, this year we wanted to do things differently. I wanted to spend Christmas at my house. Would you be willing to come? I felt a warmth in my chest. Of course I accept. My daughter and Mom. We were going to split everything. The food, the organization. We don't want you to have to work. We just want you to bepress. Just enjoy yourself. Just be our mother. I hung up the phone with tears in my eyes, but they were tears of joy, of gratitude, of fulfillment, because I realized they had learned. They had learned that I wasn't a tool. I wasn't someone who was there to serve. I was a person who deserved to be cared for, who deserved to rest, who deserved simply to be. On Christmas Day, I arrived at Beatrice's house, and everything was beautiful, simple, but made with love. The table was set, the food smelled delicious, the children were running and playing. And when I sat down at the table, surrounded by my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchild, I felt a peace I had never felt before. It wasn't the peace of someone who has everything. It was the peace of someone who is enough, of someone who knows that their worth doesn't depend on what they have or what they give, but simply on who they are. And I looked around at those people I loved, and I realized that the journey had been worth it. All the pain, all the loneliness, the whole process of deconstruction and reconstruction had been worth it, because now we were there, not out of obligation, not out of self-interest, not out of convenience, but out of true love, by choice, out of a genuine desire to be together. And that, I realized, was the true gift, the gift that money could never buy. Because, in the end, what I learned was this: when we change who we are on the inside, when we stop living in lack and start living in fullness, when we value and respect ourselves, life responds. People respond, everything responds. Not meekly, not inexplicably, but consistently. Really, and the greatest wealth I realized at that moment, wasn't in the bank. It wasn't in material possessions. It was there, at that table, in those faces, in those smiles, in that love that was finally true. Because I had learned that a person's true worth is not in what they possess. It's in who they are and in how they choose to live. And when you learn this, when you truly incorporate this into your life, everything changes. Not because life is magic, but because you've become the person who attracts what truly matters. And what truly matters, I discovered, has never been priceless. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story like this is shared here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. You can share if you've ever experienced something similar, what this story evoked in you, or even where you're watching it from. Sometimes, writing a few words is the first step in realizing that you're not alone.